Let us go to the first puzzle. The threats are: queen takes bishop, rook takes bishop, knight takes rook, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: knight takes rook, bishop takes queen, knight takes queen. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks: rook to c2, check. Bishop to g4, check. Queen to b5, check. Queen to c4, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen to g4, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to e8, f3, bishop to d7, queen takes rook, check. Bishop takes queen. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook, bishop takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: rook takes rook, rook takes rook, bishop to d6, rook takes pawn, bishop takes knight, check. King takes bishop, bishop takes bishop. One more, here are the threats: knight takes pawn, knight takes rook, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. The answer is: knight takes pawn, rook takes knight, queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen. One more, here are the threats: queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to d4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to d4, check. King to h2, knight takes knight. Let's continue. Here are the threats: queen takes rook, queen takes bishop, queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, knight takes bishop, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: queen takes rook, check. Knight to e7, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes bishop, queen to b8, queen takes rook, check. One more, the threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: king to g7, queen to c7, check. King to g8, knight to f3, queen takes bishop. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: knight takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to a4, check. Queen to h5, check. The best move in puzzle position is: knight to f3, bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to f8, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen to h4, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to c5, check. g3, check. Rook to f3, check. Rook to d2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. g3, check. King to g2. Rook to d2, check. Rook to e2. Rook takes rook, check. Knight takes rook. Bishop to h3, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to h2, check. Bishop to e3, check. Rook to g2, check. Rook to e1, check. The puzzle is solved using: bishop to e3, check. King to f1. Rook to f2, check. King to e1. Rook takes bishop. Let's continue. The threats are: knight takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are: knight to f6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Bishop to h7, check. Solution to the puzzle is: knight takes pawn, check. King to h8. Knight takes pawn, check. King to g8. Knight to h6, check. Next puzzle. Here are the threats: queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is d4. Queen to d3. Bishop to b7, check. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using queen to h6, check. King to g8. Knight takes pawn, checkmate. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to d3. King to d6. King to e4. King to e6. c4. Rook to a8. Knight takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g8, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to h8, check. King to f7. Queen to h5, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes queen, check. King takes queen. Rook takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are pawn takes pawn, check. The answer is pawn takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn, check. King to d4. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to f7, check. Rook to e4, check. Bishop to d6, check. Bishop to e3, check. The answer is bishop to d6, check. King to f5. Rook to e5, check. King to f6. Rook takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are pawn takes pawn. Queen takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes knight. Rook to d8. Queen to c3. Queen takes knight. Knight takes queen. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Rook to h7, check. Rook to d3, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to d2. Rook to g8, check. King to f5. Rook to f6, check. King takes rook. Next, here are the threats. Rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to f7, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to f7, check. King takes rook. King takes rook. g6, check. King to g4. b5. c5. Let's continue. Threats in this position are rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. The checks are rook to a8, check. Queen to e6, check. Queen to e8, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to a8, check. King to d7. Rook takes rook. Queen to b1, check. Queen to f1. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are bishop takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes queen. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to e2, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes pawn, check. King to d1. Rook takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h7, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to f4. Knight to f8. Queen to h5. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to h7. Knight to g6, check. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are knight takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes knight. Rook takes knight. Bishop to d6. Rook to e4. Bishop takes rook. Let's continue. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to h3. Rook takes pawn, check. King to f3. f5. Promotes to queen. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.